Well, hey everybody, it's Sandy and welcome back to my channel dedicated to helping you advocate for your own health, one topic at a time. So guys, today I want to talk about a couple of recently published studies that shed some light on long COVID, and one in particular that discusses vaccination and its relationship to long COVID. So just keep watching. Yeah, so first of all, I just want to say thank you. Thank you so much and welcome. Thank you for those of you who are over in the Facebook groups page. You know that I was sick for the last week, a little over a week. Fortunately, it wasn't COVID that I know of. I did serial PCRs and everything was negative. It's a real mystery how I got any kind of a respiratory virus because I hadn't been around anybody for the previous week, 2 weeks, except for like curbside pickup where I'm wearing a mask and the windows are all down. And yeah, I don't know. It was, I guess, one of these rare instances where the transmission was by fomites. I'm grateful that I'm all better and I thank you all for your good wishes. And yeah, so I'm back. And welcome also to those of you who are newly subscribed. I see I have some new subscribers. If you are finding my content helpful, but you haven't subscribed yet, I really hope that you'll consider subscribing and please share with anybody who might find the content helpful. So thank you for that as well. Yeah, so I recently read a couple of different studies that talk about long haul, and I know that that's been a topic on the Facebook groups page, and frankly myself, that's one thing I'm really interested in and most concerned about really, because being vaccinated and boosted now, I'm not worried that I'm going to end up in the hospital if I get a case of COVID. I'm not worried that I'm going to have even really a severe disease, but I've heard a lot of people say, and I have to, this resonates with me, you know, I'm worried about long COVID. What about if I get long COVID? Because there still is some risk. Even if you are vaccinated and have breakthrough. Now, the good news is the risk from what we've seen previously, I think the last bit of information I read before what I'm getting ready to discuss right now said that the risk of long COVID with vaccinated people, and this was before boosting, was about half of the risk of long COVID in people who were not vaccinated. So that was excellent. And I think it was like 10% versus 5%. That was before boosting, so I suspect it's even better after boosts. And somebody did write in the Facebook group a few weeks ago that some of the aspects of long COVID are things that we see anyway in society. A certain number of people say that they have fatigue and they have aches and joint aches and things like that. In fact, there's long post-viral syndromes from other viruses, so that's true. But I still don't want to completely diminish the concerns that people have about long COVID because I think it's understandably scary. So enter a couple of pieces of research that came out recently. I'm going to first talk about one that delineates 4 issues that seem to predispose people to long COVID. And then I'm going to talk about another one that came out of Israel even more recently that discusses whether being vaccinated can influence the risk of developing long COVID. So in the first study that I just referred to, I think most people have seen this by now, there are 4 factors that they said they tweezed out that would predispose somebody to long COVID. Now, this doesn't mean that if you have any of these things, like, for example, type 2 diabetes, it doesn't mean that if you come to the table with these things that you're going to get long COVID, but it means that your likelihood of becoming long COVID, according to this piece of research, was greater than it is amongst the general population at large. Now, in this study, they only followed 300 and something people, and they followed them up to, I think, 3 months post-COVID. So I would have liked to see a lot more people, and I would have liked to see them follow them past 6 months, maybe even a year. But, you know, there's always flaws. But in my opinion, I think that this just really calls out for more research. But at the same time, the 4 things that they delineated weren't all that surprising to me. So one of them was a high level of messenger RNA of COVID in the blood. And I think that does speak to viral load. And it would make sense that with a higher viral load means you're probably having some trouble clearing the virus. You're more likely to have a struggle with this going forward. So the second issue was the presence of certain autoantibodies. The third issue was a reactivation of Epstein-Barr. And finally, the fourth was the presence of type 2 diabetes, pre-existing. You know, I look at these and it is a little bit sobering. It's not real surprising, actually. I mean, maybe type 2 diabetes seems to me that it just doesn't fit with the others. The 3 other issues seem to relate to immune health. You know, if you have a higher level of the viral DNA in your blood, you're not clearing it as quickly, or maybe you had just too much viral load for your immune system to handle that efficiently. Presence of autoantibodies, Epstein-Barr. These things all seem to speak to immune health, and type 2 diabetes is a metabolic disease. And let's just distinguish that right away from type 1 diabetes, which is an autoimmune disease. Type 2 diabetes is a metabolic disease. Now, I did find some good news here, because when I look at these, I see a lot of things that we can do to advocate for ourselves and see to it that we minimize the risk that we are going to get long COVID, at least according to this particular piece of research. Now, for one thing, in terms of the viral load, you can get vaccinated. Vaccinated individuals don't tend to struggle with that high viral load because their body is all primed and ready for the fight. And people who are unvaccinated have to start from square one if they are immune naive, and they have to start making all these antibodies, and it gives the virus a lot of time to replicate. Whereas if you are vaccinated, your immune system is going to recognize it immediately. So certainly we can control that factor to some extent. The presence of certain autoantibodies and the reactivation of Epstein-Barr, I'm going to put those two in one category. That is something that you're either predisposed to, either you have some autoimmune issues or you've had Epstein-Barr in the past, and there's not really a whole lot you can do about that. But you certainly can do what is within your power to enhance your own immune health and take good care of yourself so that your body is better equipped to fight when it is presented with not only SARS-CoV-2, but anything else for that matter. So certainly working closely with your provider, whoever is treating you for this underlying disease, staying on top with your medications that you're taking, if any. I do supplement for my immune health. I've talked about it before on my channel. I take and have for years vitamin C, vitamin D, and zinc. I'm also taking quercetin now and a few other things. Now, let me just insert my usual disclaimer, which is that I'm not giving any individual medical advice on this channel. Nothing that I say should be deemed a substitute for the advice of your own qualified practitioner. I am telling you what I do. If you are interested in doing any of these things, I think it makes sense to have a discussion with your own provider. I also check my vitamin D levels annually. And then finally, with type 2 diabetes, here's the great news. Type 2 diabetes, like I said a moment ago, is a metabolic disease. I like to refer to it as a first world disease. This is not something that takes place in the third world. This isn't something that our ancestors had. This is completely a metabolic disease because we are a society that's produced to excess, and we have excess. We are able to stockpile food. The kinds of things you stockpile that don't go bad, that sit in the pantry, tend to be things like carbs, simple carbs, even complex carbs, refined sugars. The great thing about type 2 diabetes being one of the predisposing issues to long COVID is that if you have type 2 diabetes, in my opinion, you can absolutely reverse it. Now, I think that's a tall order. I don't think it's easy, but I'm going to recommend you start with just one thing, and that is intermittent fasting. I think intermittent fasting is about the best thing you can do for your metabolic health. Again, same disclaimer you heard a moment ago, so please discuss this with your own qualified practitioner. I'm not giving any individual medical advice, but intermittent fasting absolutely can reverse type 2 diabetes. Now, in my opinion, it's going to take a few things. It's also better to cut down on sugars, particularly refined sugars, if not cut them out if you are a type 2 diabetic. At the same time, I think for most people, it's best to do one thing at a time. And if I had to pick just one thing, I would do the time-restricted eating, which is a form of intermittent fasting. Intermittent fasting is an umbrella term. I have been practicing it in the form of time-restricted eating for, I think, over a decade now. And I started back when it was a really fringe thing. Nobody had heard of it. And in fact, I can remember a personal trainer I was working with at the time trying to talk me out of it. I am so glad I stayed with it. It's been the best thing I've ever done for my metabolic health. I don't think that weight control is even the primary reason to do it, although I think most people find intermittent fasting because they've tried a lot of different things to manage their weight and then they move on to this one. It's just another thing they try. But I think the benefits of intermittent fasting are so far reaching that weight is just the tip of the iceberg. Whether you'll lose weight, intermittent fasting has a lot to do with what you eat during the periods of time you're eating, and it also has to do with how close you are to your ideal weight. You know, if you're very close to your ideal weight and you try intermittent fasting, you might lose a little weight. It might be slow, but really the important thing is that when you do time-restricted eating, you lose body fat. This is a little bit of a tangent and probably for a different video, but I just want to illustrate to you how important this point is. So there was one study that I read a while back where people were taken and put in two different groups. Now, in both groups, these people were fed and their diets were designed so that they were not going to lose any weight. They were going to maintain their weight through the entire course of the study through to the end. And they did, in fact. But in group A, they got to consume anytime they wanted. And in group B, they were practicing time-restricted eating. And what happened is at the end of the study, even though everybody maintained their weight, group B, which was the experimental group who had been intermittently fasting, had a completely different body composition. So their lean body mass accounted for a greater percentage because their percent fat dropped. So your body composition will change. And the reason that intermittent fasting works like that is because when you go through a period of, say, 16 hours, what happens is for the first several hours, you do what you're used to doing. Your body, when it needs energy, takes it from the blood sugar. That's the most readily available source of energy, and it doesn't require any kind of conversion. It's not biologically costly for that reason. It's easy, and that's what your body will do. And typically, before we run out of that, we eat more. And so we're always drawing off of our blood sugar. But when you're fasting, after a certain number of hours, you will tap out of the blood sugar. And maybe your stomach will say, send down some food here because you're used to only drawing from blood sugar. But if you don't feed yourself and you need more energy, you will turn to another source. And what the body will turn to is glycogen stores. Glycogen is stored in the muscles. It's also stored in the liver. And glycogen does have to be converted then into glucose. So that's a little bit biologically costly, but you will tap those stores out as well. After you get to about 13 hours into a fast, you've tapped out of your glycogen stores, and then you must tap into fat because that's the only other source. It's the most biologically costly. It's a lot of converting to get fat to turn into energy, which is glucose. But that is really the only way to efficiently tap into body fat and get rid of it. This process by which we continually eat and we don't ever get to empty out those glycogen stores that are clogging up the liver, this is what's created type 2 diabetes. We get fatty liver, we get metabolic syndrome, and then the next step is type 2 diabetes. It's not only about your fasting sugars. You'll see that in the lipid profile. The lipid profile is a window into how your liver is processing carbs. And the best way to have your liver efficiently process any carbs is to, first of all, not have too many. And second of all, to make sure you tap out those glycogen stores so that it gets emptied daily and you're not having those pile up, which is creating fatty liver. All those piled up carbs get converted to fat, and that is reflected in your lipid profile. This is very reversible. If anybody wants me to talk more about this, please let me know and put a comment down in the comment section, because almost any question about intermittent fasting is its own topic and it's beyond the scope of this video. But suffice it to say, type 2 diabetes, if it renders you more likely to have long COVID, all I can say is that's not the only thing. It renders you more likely to have all kinds of health problems, and this is something that is within your grasp to fix. So enough said about the 4 factors that render you more likely than the population at large to develop long COVID if you are to get infected. I'm going to move on to another study that came out of Israel just recently that also examined long COVID, but it examined the impact of vaccination and whether vaccination might help in preventing long COVID. Now, this also was a study that followed people, and this one asked people questions. There is an issue with self-reporting, but I believe that whatever bias that presents is a wash between the two groups. So what they did is they followed 951 people who were infected, and they followed 2,437 people who were not infected. I love that this is such a large group. In the group that was infected with COVID, 67% of them had been vaccinated. So those are breakthrough cases. What they did is they compared the likelihood of developing 4 things: fatigue, headache, weakness, and persistent muscle pain. And they looked at the likelihood of developing that, and then they looked at the likelihood that that was going to stick around. What they found is that people who had received 2 doses of messenger RNA vaccine were no more likely to report any of these symptoms than people who had never been infected. And again, they had a very, very large group of people who had never been infected. So I thought that was really good news. In addition to that, I'm just going to read you how it broke down, is that after follow-up and adjusting for all kinds of things they had to adjust for, the people who received 2 doses were less likely than the unvaccinated individuals to report any of these symptoms by 64% with fatigue, 54% with headache, by 57% when it came to weakness, and by 68% when it came to muscle pain. So that's how much less likely you were to report those things long lasting if you were vaccinated rather than if you were unvaccinated. And furthermore, they had the group to compare, a much larger group of people who were never infected at all. And what they could show was that the people who were vaccinated and suffered with breakthrough had going forward some of these same things, headache, weakness, fatigue, but it was no more than in the group who had never been infected to begin with. So that speaks to, again, there's a certain amount of headache in the baseline population before COVID ever got here, right? There's a certain number of people who have this pain or that problem. And what they found is that the people who had been vaccinated and had breakthrough cases, even though in the end of the study period, there was still some persistent headaches or some whatever it might be, it was no more than the percentage of the population at large. Now, I think this is going to be followed up with more study. I found this to be great news. The day I read this, I posted it in the Sandy's DIY Health Advocacy Facebook groups page, and I got a lot of comments about it. And one of the comments I got was, why didn't they look at the loss of taste and smell? Because I agree. That's something that is very concerning for me. And I think that's kind of underappreciated, the impact that could have. I mean, that's been linked to depression. I actually know somebody who didn't end up only with a loss of taste and smell, but like when the smell came back and it was all distorted. So things tasted or smelled really awful that would normally be pleasant. At last I heard that was getting better. And by the way, that was during Delta. I don't think that's common with Omicron at all. In fact, the loss of taste and smell is almost non-existent with the Omicron variant. But I did agree. I would have liked to have seen that. The one thing I can say that bodes very well is that all of these things, when I read the percent to which the likelihood of getting it was reduced, what did I say? So it was like by 64%, 54%, 57%, 68%, they were all roughly the same. They were very, very close together. It wasn't like one of these symptoms, the likelihood was reduced by 65% and the other one was 10. So logic would dictate that the same thing would be true for the loss of taste and smell. And I hope to see that studied at some point in the very near future. Yeah, I just wanted to talk about these couple of things. Now, for me, this is a game changer. I think that, at some point we are all going to have to live with the risk of COVID. No doubt we're going to continue to have better therapeutics and maybe better vaccines and all kinds of things that we're going to learn over time. And we're also going to incur more immunity in the population. But we all have to live with the risk of COVID. So we all have to decide for ourselves when we're going to get out there and re-engage. Now, for me, the questions about the likelihood of long COVID is a very, very big one, especially I'm coming to the table with some background of autoimmune disease. And it's a concern for me. This really helped me. This also does not even account for a boost. This is only looking at people who had 2 doses of a messenger RNA vaccine. And I would think that boosting would even help this further. So, for me, this just really goes a long way. When I read this, I felt a sense of gratitude wash over me. So let me know what you guys think about this. And let me know furthermore what you have about that sidebar that I went into on type 2 diabetes and intermittent fasting. Perhaps getting started with intermittent fasting would be a good next exercise to do in the Facebook group now that we've finished our 1 week of gratitude exercise. I wonder if we could all partake in some exercise that has to do with intermittent fasting for 1 week and check in. I don't know. Let me know what you guys think. And let me know if this was helpful. And until next time, be well. Bye-bye.